Okay, hello, I'm Dave Wilhelm, president of GSM, the Geological Society of Minnesota. Welcome to the fifth GSM lecture of the 2021 schedule. Our tonight's topic is Minnesota's Geologist, the life of Newton Horace Winchell by author Sue Leaf. I'll introduce Sue shortly. Thanks for being part of a tradition that goes back 82 years to 1938. The format, as most of you know, is these announcements and then Sue's 1-hour lecture followed by Q&A. Alas, still no cookie break like we do normally, but you can eat cookies at home if you like. So all participants other than the host, the presenter, and the moderators are muted for most of the lectures, including this one. Randy Strobel is the host, and he and I are moderators, and Steve Erickson's also a moderator. Thanks, as always, Randy, for setting up these Zoom webinars. The Zoom platform offers a number of means for interaction. We like to handle most questions at the end. There's a Q&A icon. Just click that and type in your question, and we'll get to it at the end. You can do that anytime during the lecture. For those few persons that are joining by phone, we will unmute them at the end in case they have any questions. And we might also mute other questioners if they need to clarify their question. If you have a quick question for which you like an immediate answer, click the raise hand icon and enter the question. For these, we'll use our best judgment about interrupting the presenter during her presentation. You can also use raise hand to report any technical issues you might experience. There's also a chat option that allows you to type a message for all participants to see. You can use that before the lecture. Well, it's not before the lecture anymore, but use the all panelists and attendees option if you want everybody to see it. There's a couple other ways we use chat, and you'll hear about those in a minute. Most of these webinars, including this one, are recorded and will be made available on YouTube. We will send members and other participants an email with the link when each becomes available, usually probably tomorrow that'll happen. As always, the full lecture schedule is on our website. Thanks to Steve Erickson for arranging another outstanding slate of topics and presenters and coping with COVID-19. The next lecture in 2 weeks, November 30th, will be the Mesozoic Vertebrates of Antarctica by Peter whatever, you can read his name there. Professor of Earth and Environmental Science at the U of M. So we're going to see more of Antarctica. We saw Antarctica a week ago, and we'll see them in 2 weeks. This webinar, as all GSM webinars, is copyrighted by the author. We kindly request that you respect the copyright by not forwarding the Zoom link nor recording the lecture yourself. Thank you. As with all our live lectures, this lecture is free and open to the public, not just GSM members. And a few people did sign up that weren't members ahead of time. If you're not a GSM member, we ask you to open the chat box and type non-member and your city, state, or province or country, depending on where you're living. And also mention how you found out about us. We like to see how many non-members attend so we can see how well our information reaches the general public. Also, we can count the number of devices that tune in, but not the number of people watching from each device. So we can get a better count of how many are listening in. If you are watching and with at least one other person, type 2 persons or whatever number it is in the chat box. That way we can add up later for the actual total attendance. These lectures are eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. If that's something you can use the chat to request the form. Include your name and your email address. And if you don't want everybody to see your email address, there's a chat option that allows you to have only the host see it. And then following the meeting, I can fill out the form, sign it, and email it to you. Also, as I announced by email a few days ago, we elected officers for the 2021 year at the recent GSM board meeting last Thursday. Joe Newberg will serve as our president starting in January 1st. Patrick Bunstein will be vice president, and Dave Kelso is continuing his double duty as secretary and treasurer. These terms start January 1st, and I wish to personally thank each of them for stepping up to these roles. GSM has been around since 1938 only because of people who care enough to make it work. And then also at our most recent board meeting, the board decided that all our lectures will remain online at least through April of 2021, which probably doesn't surprise any of you. Normally the last lecture in May would be our spring banquet. We have left undecided whether we will have a spring banquet or just another online lecture. We'll decide that at the February board meeting. But given recent pandemic developments, I would say a banquet looks unlikely, but we'll let you know in February. Any other announcements? If there's a raised hand there, I don't see anything, so I assume that's not happening. So I'm going to introduce Sue. Sue Leaf is a native Minnesotan. She was educated at Gustavus and at the University of Minnesota in zoology. She's the author of 5 books, one of which was named a Midwestern Book Award winner, and others were named as finalist. We'll hear more about her most recent book tonight. So welcome, Sue. We look forward to hearing from you about Newton Horace Winchell. And I'm going to unshare my screen now, and then you can start sharing yours.
Okay.
And I can see your screen. And so I'm going to mute
Hear me.
myself so you can do your business.
Okay, and you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, I start my book in the introduction by talking about having a geological eye. And I'm sure that most of you tuning in tonight know what I mean, but just exactly what does that mean? Well, when you look at this picture, what do you see? Is it a good place for a pictograph or an example of volcanic rock? This is a basalt outcropping on the St. Croix River by my home. If you think it looks like rocks on the North Shore, that's because both outcroppings were a result of a mid-continental rift that formed 1.1 billion years ago. As for pictographs on this rock, well, I'm not saying anything. And what do you see when you look at this? Mosses and liverworts in competition on a cliff, or a series of ancient seabeds? These are limestone cliffs above the Kickapoo River in southwestern Wisconsin, and that's my son and daughter-in-law in the canoe. The Kickapoo runs through the driftless area, and the limestone outcroppings are the remains of seabeds that once covered the area. But mosses and liverworts are also slinging it out on this cliff face. And Robin Wall Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, did her doctoral thesis on them. A geological eye is in part depending on what you look at. Newton Winchell developed his geological eye in his early 20s, and my book will tell you how he saw the world. Winchell was born in upstate New York in 1839 on Winchell Mountain. It's not really upstate New York. It was closer to New York City, named for his family near the New York State-Connecticut border. He could count back 4 generations of Winchells on that mountain. Looking toward the Catskills as a child, he could see far. Surely this must have inspired in him a tendency to take the long view. Winchell grew up poor. His parents were both school teachers. At 15, though he wanted to continue his education, he took a teaching job in a one-room schoolhouse, much like the one pictured here. He taught 5 levels of reading, writing, arithmetic, algebra, geography, and oratory, which he called declamation. On Saturdays, a half day, he held a spelling bee to inspire the competitive urges in his students. With his meager salary, he helped his mother pay the bills. He bought a decent set of clothes and a train ticket to Ann Arbor, Michigan. In Ann Arbor, his oldest brother, Alexander, was a professor of natural history at the Young University of Michigan. He offered to supervise Newton's education and provide a home while Newton pursued a college degree. Alex was in charge of the Michigan Geological Survey, and in 1860 offered Newton a job as the survey's botanist. Although Newton knew nothing about plants, so this was clearly a nepotism move. Alex is shown here with his wife, Julia, also college educated, and 2 daughters. At the time of the photo, the family had already lost 2 children to childhood illness and would lose 2 more. This tragedy would haunt Newton Winchell. Alexander was a rising star at Ann Arbor, and he would serve as Newton's mentor for decades. Perpetually in need of money, Newton alternated taking college classes with teaching school to fund his education. Now in his 20s, his school duties expanded. He taught himself German and French. He already knew Latin and Greek. He taught natural history and astronomy and music. The Winchell family were all very musical, and Winchell had a nice baritone voice. At a large high school in St. Clair, Michigan, he was co-principal with Charlotte Imus, a college grad with a very good mind. College grad in 1860. Newton fell head over heels in love with the intellectual, idealistic young woman, and they married in 1864. Lottie is second from the left. The photo is of the Albion College faculty in 1860. Lottie was an Albion grad, and at age 22 had been hired to teach there. After several years of teaching school and seasonal jobs doing geological survey work in Michigan and Ohio, Newton was offered a plum job heading up Minnesota's newly instituted Geological and Natural History Survey. It was actually 3 jobs: conducting a survey of all the rocks, animals, and plants in the entire state, teaching science classes at the university, and setting up and running a natural history museum to display what the survey had found. The offer came from the university president, William Watts Falwell, pictured here. Falwell, who was a very good scholar, was only 39 at the time, 7 years older than Winchell, who was only 32. The position initially paid $1,000 a year. Not a lot of money, but job security. So he was heading up the survey. He taught classes at the U in the winter, in the spring, even though he had a field season. And he was supposed to set up a natural history museum to display what he found on his survey so the students could learn from the museum. Falwell told him it would most likely take him 20 years. So after going year to year to different jobs, having a 20-year job guarantee was amazing. When Winchell arrived in Minnesota in 1872, the university consisted of exactly 1 building, this one. This is Old Main shown here. It was located on the University Knoll, where Shevlin Hall is today. And that is Platteville limestone that had been quarried at Spirit Island, which is just below on the river. The legislature had given the University of Minnesota Board of Regents supervisory power over the survey. This was a big deal because it meant that the survey was going to be tilted more to the scientific than to purely a functional endeavor that could have political implications and result in the firing of him. Winchell was given rooms in Old Main, and the Natural History Museum was also housed here. Whatever happened to Old Main? Well, it went up in flames in a spectacular fire in 1904. What did the survey entail? Well, he had to make a geological map of each county. So he had to know what was into the surface. He had to assess the bedrock for use as building stone. In Minnesota, we have limestone, we have dolomite, we have granite, we've got other types of building stone, and Winchell had to decide whether it was actually high quality stone. The legislature was interested in knowing if we had fuel sources other than wood. Iowa had found peat and some lignite beds, and they were interested in that. The legislature was interested in economically useful ores. There were rumors that iron ore and copper were in the Arrowhead region. He was supposed to look at soil types and ascertain whether it would be good farmland. They needed to know meteorological data because farming, of course, is dependent upon rainfall. And then when anything else appeared on the scene that was of scientific nature, Winchell claimed that for himself. So for example, the recession of St. Anthony Falls fell under his jurisdiction, and well contamination in the Red River Valley, and the grasshopper plagues of the mid 1870s, and trying to figure out what happened to them. Winchell claimed a lot for the survey. It seems like an overwhelming job, but he was young and had boundless energy. So in the fall of 1872, in his first fall field season, as an introduction to the state, Winchell visited parts of Minnesota accessible by railroad. There were 12 railroad companies operating in Minnesota at the time, and Winchell arranged free passes for him and his workers on all of them. He looked at rock outcrops and quarries, river valleys and waterfalls. The first trip he took was to Winona, and he talked to Professor Phelps at the Normal School, who had a terrific trilobite collection. He looked up William Hurlbut in St. Charles, the former mayor of Rochester, who was himself an amateur geologist and gave Winchell lots of good tips on where to look. He followed the St. Croix River Valley north, inspected the Washington County Courthouse in Stillwater, and spent the night at the Chisago House in Taylor's Falls. After 3 months on the job, including 2 months in the field, he produced a 129-page annual report, the first one, and it included a map. That was just a sign of things to come. Winchell's reports were always very lengthy. 2 years later, Winchell was offered the position of geologist to accompany General George Armstrong Custer on an expedition to the Black Hills. 2 years after he had arrived, there was still construction in Old Main, and he didn't have enough room to analyze the specimens he had collected, and so he felt like he would be twiddling his thumbs in 1874, and then this offer came through. Officially, the expedition was to explore territory that had been ceded to the Lakota in an 1868 treaty. Unofficially, it was to look for gold. Winchell had access to Custer, and you would have thought the two would have hit it off. They were nearly identical in age, both being born in December 1839. Both men had grown up poor and clawed their way up to some semblance of social status. Both had married Michigan farm girls, and the Custers retained ties to southeastern Michigan, where the Winchells had spent 2 happy years. Both had younger brothers that they were close to. But a friendship never happened, and after the 1874 expedition, Winchell never mentioned Custer again in any letters or papers that I had access to. The expedition itself was an immense undertaking with 951 soldiers and officers, 100 wagons, each pulled by 6 mules, and 16 brass band musicians on white horses that played for the general nearly every night. Not the horses playing, the musicians played. Winchell made geological notes on southwestern South Dakota, collected mammals for the University Natural History Museum, and in a mistake of colossal proportion, did not find gold in the Black Hills. Perhaps the most worrisome problem facing a young Minnesota was that St. Anthony Falls was receding upstream. The falls, which powered sawmills and flour mills and drove the Minneapolis economy, were not stable. The limestone ledge over which they spilled kept breaking off. If the limestone ledge broke off to its margin, the falls would transform into a mere rapids, and Minneapolis would lose its power source. Okay, let's take a while to look at this map. The dates and the dashed lines show where St. Anthony Falls were at that date, so you can see how they're moving towards the top of the screen, upriver. Since the 1600s, eyewitnesses had reported 6 islands in the vicinity of the falls and the location of the falls with respect to the islands. Using the dates of these accounts, Winchell calculated how quickly the falls are moving upstream, since rate equals distance over time, like miles per hour. One personal quality aiding in this was that Winchell had a mathematical mind. All the Winchells did. Newton had once avoided taking a final math test in college by solving a difficult problem before the test. He was the only person in the class that was allowed to skip the final. Winchell assumed that the falls had initially spilled into the Minnesota River at where Fort Snelling is today, after the last glacier retreated. Knowing the rate calculated from the eyewitness accounts of where the falls were, and the distance of the falls to Fort Snelling, he calculated the number of years since the falls began, which equals the time that has passed since the last glacier. This clear-eyed calculation answering a major geological question, how long ago was the last glacier, garnered Winchell accolades from near and far. He was the first person in the world to estimate the end of the Ice Age. 8,000 years, and that was much more recent than most people realized, and he was actually pretty close. After he published his work, geologists eyed Niagara Falls to assess it in the same way. Meanwhile, his wife Lottie was making her own history, same year. Weeks after the state legislature allowed women to hold an elected position on school boards, she ran for office and won. So she was the first woman in the state to hold elected office, along with Charlotte Van Cleve. The local newspaper, Lottie, an ardent feminist, considered it a major advance in women's rights. The local newspaper, the Minneapolis Evening Mail, carried an account of the historic first school board meeting. It was careful to note what the women wore to the meeting: black dresses, hats, and gloves. Lottie wore a red bow around her neck. After the meeting, a male school board member escorted the women to their horse and carriage. Lottie clipped the article and kept it in her scrapbook. On that meeting, she was named secretary for the school board, and she promptly turned around and started writing a history of the East Minneapolis schools. In 1878, the legislature directed Winchell to go to the North Shore. Interest in possible iron ore deposits was heating up. He and a team spent June through August on Lake Superior, visiting sites like Gooseberry Falls, Palisade Head, and Grand Marais, a natural harbor with 2 log cabins and a fishing shack. Of all the beautiful sights on the North Shore, Winchell was most impressed by the narrow gorge of the Temperance River. Like so many others, he imagined jumping across it. The gorge is that narrow, but he also observed, like nearly everyone else does, that you better make it sure that you go to the other side, because a mistake would result in a 100-foot drop into a tumultuous river. This is one of his photos, by the way. Later in September, he hired 2 Ojibwe guides from Grand Portage and went without his team to survey the United States-Canada border. He bought a birch bark canoe for the trip, which is still in the collection of the Minnesota Historical Society. Here's Winchell's photo of the canoe taken in front of Pillsbury Hall. Realizing the geological complexity of northeastern Minnesota and needing permanent help, Winchell hired glacier geologist Warren Upham to survey the glacial till covered counties of the state, those in the southwestern and western parts. Upham's beat included the Red River Valley, which he identified as a former glacial lake, as did Winchell. And he named it Glacial Lake Agassiz after Louis Agassiz, the Swiss geologist who had first postulated that glaciers once covered the northern hemisphere. Many Minnesotans know Upham better as the author of Place Names of Minnesota, which is a book that's still in print and still widely used. Note that the first field season, he traveled 3,300 miles by horse and cart. The 1980s were an expansive era for Minnesota, for Minneapolis, for the field of geology, and for Winchell personally. In 1883, the American Association for the Advancement of Science held their national meeting on the University of Minnesota campus. And the preparation for this mammoth event, it included 1,000 guests and their spouses, involved nearly the entire town of Minneapolis, and a number of people, because it strained the capacity of the hotels in Minneapolis, a number of people were housed out at Lake Minnetonka and took the streetcar in. They took a field trip to Taylor's Falls to see the potholes. Of course they did. In 1884, volume 1 of his final report was released to great acclaim. In 1887, the first professional journal devoted solely to geology was launched from Winchell's house at 120 State Street. And he had been instrumental in organizing it and would serve as the managing editor for the entire length of the journal. In 1888, the Geological Society of America was organized, an offshoot from AAAS. And in 1889, the long-promised Science Hall was opened, and it was almost immediately too small. This is Winchell's house, 120 State Street. The American Geologist was produced from here. The house was located where Walter Library on the University Mall is today. The structure was a former hotel, the Cheever Hotel, and it had 18 rooms. Lottie took in boarders to help pay the bills. Many workers on the survey also lived here, and some adult Winchell children as well, and other relatives. Warren Upham, for example, was a boarder while he was working on the survey. When Winchell kids were college students, it was a beehive of activity, and son Alex held chess club meetings here. This is the University of Minnesota campus in 1900. Just like there was a boom in the flour milling industry in the 1880s, that translated into public buildings in the decade that followed. And these 4 halls all went up right about the same time. Pillsbury Hall, 1888, next to it Nicholson Hall, 1890. Eddy Hall with the little tower, 1886, and Pattee Hall that housed the law school, all went up in the same big expansion. Here's Newton Winchell behind his desk in Pillsbury Hall. He had relinquished his teaching assignments in 1879, but continued to be housed in the science department and was a well-known figure on campus. This is the Natural History Museum in Pillsbury Hall in 1897. Winchell articulated the skeleton of the giant ground sloth, Megatherium. Took him a while because he was just too busy to get around to it. And if you look carefully, you can see Winchell's canoe on top of the display cases in the back of the room. Ooh, I see an ammonite there too that I had never seen before. Winchell became interested in the use of polarized light to identify the mineral composition of rocks. In 1895, he boned up on his French and traveled to Paris to study for a year under French scientists. It's at a division of the Sorbonne. Lottie and their daughter Louise, the youngest daughter, who was a teenager, accompanied Winchell, and the family lived in faculty housing a few blocks from campus on the left bank. All the family spoke French in their everyday interactions with the locals. Louise was homeschooled. Remember, both parents were school teachers, but she later went to a French girls' academy and became quite fluent in French. Shortly after Winchell returned, the Board of Regents decided that the survey had done its job and abruptly terminated it. It remained defunct until 1911, when it was resurrected at the insistence of Professor William Emmons, who made its existence a condition of accepting the job as Geology Department head at the U. The survey today is based in St. Paul, and among other projects is mapping Minnesota's groundwater resources. The museum, the Natural History Museum, which was also part of Winchell's job, was in disarray, and Winchell was given 6 months to tidy it up. Then the title of the director was passed on to Henry Nachtrieb, who headed up the animal division of the Natural History Survey. So Winchell lost that job too. The museum itself was never closed, and in fact, eventually morphed into today's Bell Museum. But at age 59, Winchell was out of work, without a pension, without Social Security. He spent 7 years without regular work. He was now 66. And he was offered a job as state archaeologist at the Minnesota Historical Society. He was tasked with curating the society's artifacts and of writing a history of Native Americans in Minnesota based on the notes by former surveyor Jacob Brower. Brower had extensively mapped burial mounds and had died prematurely. And this is actually really played to Winchell's strengths. First of all, he was well versed in curation, and also he was very good at assembling data into a coherent whole in writing, because that's what he did with the Geology of Minnesota. So he wrote the history, the Aborigines of Minnesota. He curated their archaeological collection. And this was displayed at the new Capitol, the current Capitol that was up on the hill. But it was, the Historical Society was housed in the second Capitol, which was also standing at the time. And this is what's shown here. This is a really lovely building, although I guess the ventilation system was less than desired. Winchell became a commuter because he still retained his house on the banks of the Mississippi in Minneapolis and took the streetcar into St. Paul every day. He got the job in part because he knew Warren Upham, who had left geology and was now a secretary at the Minnesota Historical Society. The result of his compilation of the Brower's data was the Aborigines of Minnesota, published in 1911. It was hailed as the most important work on the subject at the time. And again, it was Winchillian. It was methodical and complete at 743 pages and 704 illustrations. During the course of writing the Aborigines of Minnesota, Winchell was called upon to investigate the authenticity of the Kensington runestone. The stone, a slab of gray wacke from west central Minnesota, had Scandinavian runes carved on its smooth surface. It had been discovered and debunked years earlier, but an enthusiast had resurrected the controversy, and Winchell had been drawn into it. After study, he thought the stone actually was authentic, thus keeping the myth alive. Winchell had long been interested in how long humans had been in North America. He was interested in stone tools as rocks and thought they could be dated by how they weather over time. He was actively involved in this research at the time of his death. He was not well received by archaeologists because there was quite a bit of jockeying for position going on, but today a new field of geoarchaeology credits Winchell with his pioneering questions. What remains of Winchell's legacy is too vast to sum up succinctly here. What people mention to me are Winchell Lake and the Boundary Waters, the Winchell Trail on the west bank of the Mississippi in Minneapolis, or this rock placed at the foot of the Franklin Avenue Bridge, which commemorates his calculations of the time since the last glacier. If you're familiar with the Boundary Waters, Newton Lake that leads from Fall Lake into Basswood is also named for him by his brother Alexander. And there's an Ima Lake named for his daughter. And that is it. And I'd be happy to take questions. Can I get out of here?
You can leave it up otherwise, something for us to look at.
Okay.
But, let's see, so far we don't have any questions. I'm hoping maybe somebody types a few in.
Did it go by too fast for questions, I wonder?
Well, we will give people a minute to type things in. Actually, while we're doing that, why don't I open up the audio only people, and maybe they have an audio question. Let me find that.
I know, I'm going to stop sharing. There. Can I?
Sue, this is Steve Erickson. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
All right. There was a original, the first geology person fired by the state was actually something of a corrupt person who did a scam job up in the northern area. Did you have anything come across on that story?
Well, we're not, no, I didn't. Are you talking about Eames, E-A-M-E-S?
I believe so. I believe that was the.
Yeah, I did not study them. I know there was an Owens that had done a fairly nice job in Minnesota, although real early. But Eames,
Yeah.
I don't know about. I do know that the legislature turned the responsibility of hiring their state geologists over to Falwell. And then there was a suggestion that Falwell wanted the power to make the decision because he wanted a scientist rather than someone who might be a politician. And the legislature was leery about hiring themselves because they had already made at least one bad decision.
Yeah, yeah. I remember hearing stories about it, but I didn't have a whole. For the people who are listening in, there was a claim of gold located up near Lake Vermilion area, if I remember correctly.
Right.
And the fellow who was responsible was the state geologist, but he had some money interest in it, and a lot of bad things happened from it all. And so the state killed the geological survey for a brief period of time while they tried to sort all that out.
Right. He had already also identified iron deposits in both the Vermilion and the Mesabi ranges, but he discounted them and didn't think they were very important and instead focused on the gold.
Yeah, yeah.
And
that was very typical of the time.
Right.
Gold strikes across all North America were big topics, and everybody was trying to get in on it. Some of the people made money panning the gold, but a lot of people who made the money were the guys who sold shovels to the miners, and that kind of thing was always ripe for corruption on that. But yeah, all right, thank you very much.
The gold rush to Lake Vermilion did result in the first road leading from Duluth up to Lake Vermilion. That's still being used today. I just read this in my book yet, and I see if I can think of it's under 3 different names. It's St. Louis County 4 and the Rudy Perpich Memorial Highway.
Thank you. I'm going to mute myself here then.
Okay.
Okay, we do have a few questions that have come in the last few minutes. And actually the same question came in from both Diane and Kate. How did you get interested in Winchell?
Well, that is a good question because I tried hard not to write a biography on him. Every time, first of all, I first was introduced to Winchell when I wrote my biography on Thomas Sadler Roberts, the man responsible for the Bell Museum of Natural History. Winchell was a mentor of his, was one of his professors when he was a freshman at the University of Minnesota. And it seemed like if you were a kid interested in nature and interested in birds or bugs or plants and just being outside and looking around, Winchell was always the go-to guy. He was the only professor in that field. So I thought, well, this guy is really interesting. And he had a really interesting family. He had a lot of kids. He had 5 kids, and they were all students at the University of Minnesota at one time or another, including the girls in the 1880s. And every time I thought about writing a biography of him, nothing had been written about Winchell. I thought, no, I can't do that. My geology knowledge is too thin. We know if I wrote a biography of birds, well, that's something I could write knowledgeably on, but not geology. And then I decided to go for it. And the press gave me a contact with Dick Ojikangas up at UMD. He read all my chapters and he kept me on the straight and narrow to make sure I didn't do damage to myself or to the field. But but I had graduate level paleontology, vertebrate paleontology at the university for my zoology degree. And I'd had a freshman level course at Gustavus. So it wasn't that I was totally ignorant. And I have a fairly good grasp of the history of science. In geology, it's a really, really good understanding of the history of science with its own field. So that was what I had that I brought to the table. And I've had geologists now. I'm passing the geologist test. They read the book and they write to me and they tell me that I got the geology right. And I think, thank God.
Well, thank you. We're very familiar with Dick Ojikangas. We've had talks by him and we've had field trips by him. So
yeah, fun.
You got a good resource there.
Yep.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. From Mike, what modes of transportation were used by Winchell other than canoes?
Well, he used the railroad. That's the very first thing he used. He had what he called the state outfit, which was a horse and cart. And he would sometimes go out from Minneapolis in them, or he would hire when he got to like if he got to Winona and wanted to go out to look at rock bluffs, he'd hire something from a livery. So with horse and cart, the canoe, the railroad, and then for the North Shore, he had a Mackinac boat, which is a small 21-foot boat with a sail, and it didn't have a keel, so it was trouble to keep it on course in a wind, but it could be sailed, or if that was not working for you, the wind wasn't going in the right direction, it could be rowed. And he had used the Mackinac boat with his brother Alexander in the Michigan Geological Survey on both Lakes Huron and Michigan. And so he's familiar with Mackinac boats. And I think that was it.
Okay, thank you. Of course, he used streetcars when he commuted in the.
Oh yeah, good point.
But that late in his life, yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, I probably used the streetcar to get, like when he did the geological map of Hennepin County, he probably used a streetcar to get around there too.
Okay, we have a question from Patrick. Do you know if Winchell crossed over much with Frederick Sardeson? And then I think the Sardeson, and he has a parenthetical thing here, a fascinating and difficult personage. Exclamation point.
Sardeson was after Winchell at the geological department, right?
I don't know. I can.
I don't know. After Winchell's death, I think Sardeson didn't come until after Winchell was dead. I did read some things by him, but I can't place him. I think he was in the department under Emmons. And maybe whoever asked the question can tell me. I would love
I'm trying to get him unmuted here, but
I tried to unmute myself.
Oh, you're talking. We can hear you. Go ahead, Patrick.
Okay, I think I thought Sardeson was in somewhere in the gap between when the survey was inactive, and I thought he had hopes at some point of being in charge of it when it was reconstituted. But he was an early PhD, and there's a interesting history of him among the things you can get at online from the Geological Survey, but I didn't know if he'd crossed over because Winchell seemed pretty, advanced, but fairly down to earth, and Sardeson, really big opinion of himself. It's but talented. So I was just wondering if they crossed over, but it sounds like maybe not.
No, they did not. And that's a very interesting comment about an ego. And I haven't really ever, believe it or not, evaluated Winchell for his ego. He was very confident in his scientific opinion. I would say he didn't reach an opinion quickly. He pondered information for a long time, but once he decided on something, he would battle it to the death. And he loved doing that. He loved a good fight, and he loved a good intellectual discussion. I just read today a description of what the family dinners were like, because when all the kids were in attendance, I wouldn't say they were combative, but they were argumentative, and all of them had worked as editors, and so they would argue over meanings of words and word usage. And there was a big dictionary, many volume dictionary that was at the head of the table where Winchell could get a hold of it in the middle of a fight in the middle of dinner. And the youngest daughter, Louise, who was kind of a bystander in all this because she was 7 years younger than her nearest siblings, said, we all learned quite a bit about geology after these dinners.
While I'm unmuted, I'm just going to say I'm in the middle of the book and I love it.
Good, great, good to hear that.
While you're unmuted, Patrick, why don't you read your other or ask your other question?
All right. I also was interested in the technique of word sketching some of the episodes to bring Newton to life. And was that,
Oh yeah,
did that start as purely a personal exercise that grew into part of the book? Or did you maybe think I've done something like that before and sensed that it had some potential? But I love those parts too.
very perceptive. I'd say a little bit of both. I started doing that. And by the way, although I imagine that, they're all based on absolute fact. If I mention it as a sunny day, I had been to the Tribune and I found what the weather was that day. There's some of them that have dialogue, and that's because he wrote down dialogue in his journals. But I did that partly because I felt sometimes that I was losing sight of him as a person. And so I would sketch a little scene to make him come to life. And my writing group liked them, and I liked them too. And so I thought I would include them in there and see if the editors at the University of Minnesota Press would allow me to get away with that, and they did. But I think I might have done that in the Thomas Roberts book, A Love Affair with Birds. I think I have at least one scene in there where he is birding on the grounds of what is now Washburn High School with his oldest son, who has just come back safely from the war. So yeah, that was that's actually a kind of a fun thing to do, because it's fun to see I would love to sit down and just look at Winchell and see what kind of person he was.
Well, thanks. It was awesome.
Good, great, glad you like it.
Okay, I'm going to move on to a question from Craig. Why did Falwell discontinue Winchell's employment?
It wasn't Falwell. It was the Board of Regents. Falwell was long gone by then, and I think the president at the time was Cyrus Northrop, the second president of the University of Minnesota, and the longest serving president even to this day. First of all, the survey had been funded by the sale of salt lands down by Belle Plaine, and it had outlived its source of funding. So that was kind of a thorn in the legislature's side. But Winchell was going down rabbit holes because he was so desirous of being absolutely crossing all his T's and dotting his I's, so methodical. And the Board of Regents finally had enough of it and thought, we need to move on here. It's really kind of too bad, because Winchell had in mind a really wonderful geological station for the University of Minnesota and the state as a whole that would have really put the University of Minnesota on the map in the country and possibly internationally. Winchell had the reputation to make it into an international institution, and the Board of Regents was not interested in academia in that way, and so they turned him down, which is, to me, it seems like kind of a waste. It's kind of too bad.
Thank you. I'm going to move. You have something else to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, when it was a big surprise when they terminated the survey, and a lot of people thought it was a big mistake, including the Minneapolis Journal, which wrote an editorial about that. And Winchell's geological colleagues throughout the nation were just outraged that he had been hung out to dry. They were, and then there was no pension, there was no social security, so he had to keep working at 59.
And it's a shame he couldn't get hired on somewhere else sooner.
Well, he did apply for a couple jobs and he was turned down, and he was 59. It was ageism. He was turned down because of his age.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to read a question from Jim. I've read the book. Wonderful. Perhaps you could say something about his journeys along the North Shore and along the border route back to Ely. I thought a heroic journey. I think people would be interested to hear this.
Wasn't it an amazing, I always like to build this as the canoe trip to end all canoe trips. And actually today when I read through that chapter, I followed his route on my phone on Google Maps so I could see once again. He traced the border after, okay, so this was his field season in 1878. He started in Duluth with a Mackinac boat and a crew and went all the way up to Grand Portage and stopped at the settlements and at the geological features along the way. I mean, the North Shore was too much to do in one summer. But anyway, by the end of August, they were complete with that phase of the field season. And then he sent his assistant back to study some of the rivers that flowed into Lake Superior. And he himself hired 2 Ojibwe guides and bought that canoe and took the Grand Portage Trail up to the border route. He sampled from the ledges, each of the waterfalls of Pigeon Falls, and then they went on to Partridge Falls and traced the border route until Knife Lake. And then they went into Basswood, and then they went into Fall Lake, which is right on the outskirts of what is now Ely, and they portaged into Shagwa, which is where Ely is on. And then they followed the Pine River into Lake Vermilion. So he's looking at the Vermilion Range, and then they take the Embarrass River down and they run into the St. Louis, and he's in the Mesabi Range. And then he at Floodwood, they catch, he does the Savannah Portage through Lake Sandy, and then finally to the Mississippi River. This is all in 6 weeks' time, his canoe trip to end all canoe trips. It was just he and 2 Ojibwe guides. So he was doing all the sampling. He was filling these big canvas sacks with his samples. So I'm sure those poor guides carted rocks over every portage. After a certain point, that got to be kind of a burden. And they ended up in Aiken in the second week in October, and that's the first time he had communicated with his wife since leaving the Mayhew trading post on Rove Lake, and then he came home. Yeah, so a very tough cookie he was. How old was he at that point? He was 39, almost 39. He had a reputation among the Ojibwe for being a really tough man, physically tough.
Sounds like it. I'm going to read a few comments from Diane because they're appropriate right at the moment. I think both the Canoe and Winchell's desks still exist at the survey building. I think Harvey still uses the desk, and I heard that
I think he does too. I think he told me that. Yes. Cool.
I heard that Mark Jersa portaged the canoe across University Avenue from the old building to the new building. Love all the history.
And I think that, I don't think that canoe is with the survey. I think it's with the Historical Society in one of their buildings.
I know there is a canoe in the survey building.
A birch bark canoe?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, how many birch bark canoes would the survey hold?
I don't know. But and I did hear the story about Mark Jersa porting it across University Avenue. But whether it's that particular canoe, I can't say for sure.
That's pretty cool.
I suppose we'll have to ask Harvey and Mark what they know about that canoe.
Yeah. Next time I see him.
Okay, thank you for those comments, Diane. And then also kind of related, I'm picking up questions from both chat and the questions here, so I'm looking around. From Carol, Your presentation had a photo from Lake Superior that showed pillars and arches on the water level. Is
Yeah.
that rock structure still in existence?
No. Didn't that arch fall down about 2 or 3 years ago?
I don't know.
I think it did. If my husband were in the room, he would know for certain. I think there was a picture of it in the Star Tribune, or maybe as long ago as 5 years ago.
Okay, and then I got this comment from admin, whoever that is. Oh yeah, first of all, from Jim, yes, the arch has fallen.
Good.
And this comment from admin, the canoe is at the Science Museum of Minnesota, it says.
Well, I don't know what I'd be doing there. That's interesting. Is it on display?
I don't know if admin has any more to say, he can type it in, he or she
Yeah.
can type it in. In the meantime, this question from Nancy, why do you know why they didn't name the Bell Museum after him?
Yes, because the Bell Museum received money from James Ford Bell. You name the museums after the benefactors.
And he obviously, meaning Winchell, didn't have a lot of extra money, as we heard.
Oh, he vowed he would never be poor again when he left his home, his childhood home, to go to the University of Michigan. And he was poor almost his entire life. So I do want to put in a plug for my book, A Love Affair with Birds. If you're interested in the Bell Museum of Natural History, that book tells how that museum became what it is today. It's a really cool story. And James Ford Bell was a patient, and his father, James Stroud Bell, was a patient of Dr. Roberts, who had quit his medical practice to become the curator at the Natural History Museum for free. So he was living on his savings and the grant money from his friends to do research in the summertime. And James Ford Bell was one of these benefactors. They had General Mills money, Washburn Crosby money.
Okay. I got a little more. First of all, admin has identified himself as Roger Benepe, who works at the Science Museum. And he says it is in the We Move, We Stay gallery. He's talking about the canoe now.
Okay.
And from Kate, she just asked, where is the canoe at the Science Museum? In the River Gallery or Native American? Okay, so actually, let me see if I can open up Roger's. Let's see, he's called admin here. See if I can unmute him. I'm trying to unmute you, Roger. If you're able to.
Am I there?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, it's hanging in the We Move, We Stay gallery, which for a lot of people will remember it's the former collections gallery.
So which floor is that on?
That is on the 4th floor. So you go down to the 4th floor, you go through race, and it's in the back half of race.
How did the Science Museum come by the canoe from the Historical Society?
That I cannot tell you. I have no clue, but in the plaques that are below it, it does say it is Winchell's canoe.
Okay. Well, maybe they thought it's a beautiful birch bark canoe that deserves to be seen, and maybe it's better there than away in a storage compartment.
Mm-hmm. And we also have many of his samples that he brought back.
You do?
Oh, yes.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
I wonder where they went. No one knew where they went. Some of them said they went up to Hibbing.
Yeah.
There's a facility in Hibbing.
We have a few of them. I have a couple up in MRG in one of the drawers. And also the cast of our Glyptodon down in Dinos and Fossils was made by Winchell. He made 4 of the casts, and ours is the only existing one left.
He's such a, I did not know that. He's such a autodidact. He's into so many different things. Mm-hmm. That's really cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. And Kate just mentions that Winchell probably had more than one canoe. So I don't, that's just, I don't know, you probably wouldn't know if he did or not, Sue.
Yeah, he may have, because he goes up to the boundary waters again in the 1880s, 86, with his brother Alexander. And there are 3 work parties out at the boundary waters, and each one is using a birch bark canoe. But of course, I know there's one that was owned by the Historical Society, and I don't know, I'm assuming that was the one from 1878. But good point.
Okay, I got a few questions here from Jay Kant, or Kant, however you pronounce his name. Why did he get sprung from the survey and the museum? Were there personality or funding issues? How did the family survive when he didn't have a full-time job for 7 years?
Okay, so again, I think the survey was essentially completed. He was interested in looking at the structure of the rocks using polarized light, and that was too far in the weeds for the Board of Regents, and they thought, we don't need to pay for this because we don't need to have this as part of the survey. So they turned the head of the survey over to the second part of the survey. Remember when the legislation was passed in 1872, it was a survey of rocks, plants, and animals, and that the plant and animal survey then took over, and the people who were in charge of those surveys were made head of the survey. I don't know exactly how the family made it through those 7 years. They did have that 18-room house, and Lottie continually had boarders. So she had money coming in from people that paid rent. Winchell did somehow find the capital to buy a lot across the road from him and put up a house, which he sold. And then he also did some odd jobs. He took field work, a geology field work summer job with the Anaconda Copper Company up outside of Butte, Montana. And but he found that he had suffered from rheumatism, and it was too hard for him to do field work in his 60s. So that didn't last. He was also suffering from an enlarged prostate that really was hampering him. And he had that issue addressed before he went to the Historical Society.
Okay, another question from the same person. Did Winchell play any role in the development of copper mining in the Michigan Keweenaw Peninsula?
He did not. That copper mining took off when Winchell was a boy. Took off in the 1840s, and he was born in 1839. But that's very interesting because I am up on the copper of the Keweenaw Peninsula, because that was one of the essays I wrote for my new book that I'm working on right now. That the copper deposits were actually confirmed by Douglas Houghton. Houghton, Michigan is named after him, who was the first state geologist for the state of Michigan, and who was actually unfortunately drowned at a fairly young age just off of Eagle Harbor, the coast of Eagle Harbor. And the copper mining reached its peak. Well, I mean, it had a very long run in Calumet and outside of Houghton at the Quincy mine for decades. It was one of the top copper producers of the world.
Yeah, we've had field trips up to the Keweenaw Peninsula, and it's a wonderful place to visit.
Gosh, it really is. It's one of my favorite places on earth.
Question from Dan. I was happy to hear about Lottie, Winchell's wife. Winchell was a polymath, but Lottie was political. Have you ever thought of continuing Lottie's story?
I have not. I don't think she gets the recognition she deserves. No one ever mentions her when they talk about women's suffrage, which is getting some play right now. They talk about Clara Euland, of course, but Lottie predated her. Yulin was actually a classmate of Thomas Roberts. Everything is, connected in Minneapolis. And also when you're talking about the first woman elected to public office, people tend to focus on Charlotte Van Cleve because they know of Van Cleve Park, named for her husband in Southeast Minneapolis, and the Van Cleve house is still standing in the Marcy Holmes neighborhood. But she and Lottie served together on that school board. And actually, I should also, just to flesh out that story, they were. I don't want to say they were set up, but the men who sponsored the legislation to allow women to run for the school board in the state legislature, no sooner had it passed when they turned around and they went to both women and said, now, would you run for the school board? So those men wanted to see women hold office, and they made it happen.
Okay. I don't see any more questions, but we do have one person on the phone. And that's phone number 8631. I'm going to allow you to talk.
Hi, it's Mary Helen. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Two-part question, but fairly simple. And a plug. I agree. You should do a biography of Mrs. Winchell. Absolutely. But the two-part question is: when did Newton Horace Winchell die, and what did he die of?
Okay, he died in 1914, May of 1914, and he died. He had a prostatectomy down at the Mayo Clinic at a time when it was very risky to have abdominal surgery, because of a risk of infection. But he had Charles Mayo as his surgeon, and the Mayos had already perfected antiseptic technique, and so he came through that prostatectomy very well. But it's a very tricky surgery, and he may not have gotten the entire prostate. And so he had problems again. And so this time he did not go down to Mayo. He went to Minneapolis, and he had a different surgeon, very highly regarded, but he died the next day after the surgery. And I want to say stroke, but he was 74. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you.
It was unexpected, and people were shocked when they heard that he had died.
But yeah, I would say, please do a biography on Mrs. Winchell.
Well, you need to have letters, or you need to have papers in order to have the sufficient background to do the biography. And there isn't a lot from Lottie's hand, but I do have. When they were in Paris, she wrote 2 or 3 letters before breaking her arm, and then the source of the letters dried up, which was really too bad. But they were hilarious letters, and of course she doesn't mean to be funny, but she was a teetotaler. First of all, she was a Methodist, and Methodists did not drink, at least in those days, although I think some Methodists don't drink now. And she was a member of the WCTU, the Women Christians Temperance Union. And so you go to Paris, and you're just asking for trouble, because what do you do in Paris? You drink red wine. And she had a very indignant story that she wrote to her son Alex about, where she was doing a tour of some historic site in Paris, and because of the heat, she began to feel kind of woozy, and they were really concerned, and they wanted her to sit down, and then they wanted her to have a glass of wine to recover. And she was just like horrified, and she thought the whole country was in the grips of some very dreadful habit, that she considered it Pharaoh, where is the Moses that's going to lead this country out of the grips of wine?
Oh my! But there's not letters between her and her husband.
Well, that's what's interesting, is there are love letters from between them between the short period of engagement. They were engaged like in May, and they were married in July. But the letters are from him to her. So she saved his letters, but he didn't save hers.
Oh.
I know, bummer.
Oh. Well, thank you.
His letters are really hot, though. I will say he was really quite smitten with that woman.
Made interesting reading, you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh.
a couple more comments I have here from Jay Cant, who had some questions earlier. He says, I lived in the Van Cleve house, exclamation point.
Ha.
The legend that the general's war horse is buried under the driveway.
I have not heard that, but I'm not saying it's not true.
And from Kate, great talk, thanks much. And I will agree, I'm just gonna look over here, make sure I didn't miss any questions. I don't think I did. So I will agree with Kate. This was a great talk, and for the people out there, we got a lot of good questions at the end here. So that was great. We got a lot of extra information from the questions and answers. So well, thank you, Sue.
You're welcome. I enjoyed this a lot.
Okay, and we did too.
Bye.